Good morning. As I said yesterday, my name is Craig Gillen, and I represent Bob Ward. What happened on the night of September the 21st, 2009 was a very deep tragedy. It was an accident, a tragic, tragic accident that took place in the home of Diane and Bob Ward, that took place in their bedroom. Actually, as you will learn, and this will become important during the trial of the case, it actually took place on Mr. Ward's side of the bed. It took place on Mr. Ward's side of the bed. We'll get into that later. But what happened there was a tragedy. What did Mr. Ward do after that tragic accident? He immediately called the authorities. The first thing that he did was call the authorities. Now, you're going to learn, and we want you to really think about this 911 call, because what you're going to learn is he actually called 411 in shock, stunned, been drinking, maybe slurring his words a bit. So he calls 411, and they transfer him over to 911. And that's when he's talking to the operator. This call is very important. Very important. He says, I shot my wife. And he says in the same call that the state will stress and did stress in their opening and will stress in their closing. In that same call, when he was stunned and shocked, he explained it was an accident. And it was a tragic, tragic accident. An accident, although tragic, is not a crime. An accident, like he told the 911, which the state will serve as the beginning or perhaps the early beginning of their case. His explanation that it was an accident means no criminal conduct. An accident is not a crime. Now and that's really critical when you listen to the 911 tape, to take the entire tape and listen to it and focus on what he says. Because he is the one who voluntarily picked up the phone and called. 411, they switched him over. And he's talking to the 911 operator and explains that it was an accident. Then what does he do? While he's talking to the 911 operator, he wants police to come. That's the reason why he called. He wants the law enforcement authorities to respond to the house. He stays on the call. He's trying to make sure that everything is going to be appropriate when they get there. For example, I can hear the sirens off in the distance coming. He wants to make sure that the gun is put up so that there wouldn't be any question about any danger to the officers. He goes to the front of the house to wait for them, to wait for the law enforcement officers that he called that come to their home, and to investigate this tragic accident. The exact description that he gave to the 911 operator, tragic accident. Now, what happened that night? What happened that night? In this case, we're going to really get into some science, and we're going to get into some things that the science could have told you, And maybe we wouldn't even be here if the science had been followed properly. You're going to find that in this case, when Mr. Ward called the authorities to come, the authorities came. And with some evidence, you'll find that some of the evidence, particularly the DNA evidence, was actually contaminated or destroyed in the sense that they took a step that took away from the facts of this case to this jury to find out who pulled the trigger. Now, there'll be other things that they just ignored. Whether it was sloppy, whether they made their own mind up, it doesn't matter. What you're going to find out is that they did things that were simply wrong and have taken away the opportunity for this jury to make a decision based upon all the science that was available to the police at the time to make a determination. During the opening statement of counsel for the government, we heard a lot about you could suppose this or you can assume that or you can... Well, this isn't about trying to guess somebody into a conviction. This is about what the evidence shows and what the evidence could have shown had they not ignored it or destroyed it. What happened here happened in a blink of an eye. Actually, it happened faster than the blink of an eye. And that's going to become important. Because what you're going to find out is that Mr. Ward, the evidence I would submit would show that Mr. Ward wasn't pointing a gun at Mrs. Ward. Because what you're going to find is that, you will conclude that in her hand, she had the weapon that went off very, very quickly. She wasn't staring at a gun, the evidence will show you, for this reason. Someone's pointing a gun at you, and you think they're about to shoot you. You'd put your hands up and you'd close your eyes. That part about closing your eyes, you're going to find out in this case that the evidence, the science will show you that Mrs. Ward's eyes were open. How can we tell that? Well, you're going to find out when we hear about this stippling evidence, and that's the material that comes out of the gun that has unburned powder that can burn patterns in the face. You'll hear about that. And you'll also hear that some of that was in her eye. What does that tell you? Her eyes were open. He wasn't pointing a gun at her, as suggested in the opening statement. You're going to find out a lot about Mrs. Ward. You're going to find out that Bob and Diane were married for 26 years. You will find out that they had two wonderful daughters, Mallory and Sarah. You will find out, as the state said, that during the course of her treatment by Dr. Sally West for memory, that what she did, even when the financial times were good, Mrs. Ward had a problem with anxiety, some OCD, and depression. So even when the financial status of the family was going really, really well, and there were points when it went really, really well, she had these issues. And you will find, as the financial situation, the sort of the collapse of the real estate market in 07 and 08, you will find that what happened with Mrs. Ward is that the pressure on Mrs. Ward began to become more and more and more intense on her personal and medical life. You will find that in 2007 that she was diagnosed with kind of uncontrollable anxiety and got additional medication from Dr. West. And you will find, as the testimony shows concerning the financial history of the pressure on the wards, the financial history, that she was becoming more and more and more anxious. And you will find from her doctor that she was always on the edge. Always on the edge. Now, what you will find is that you will find that she was given certain medications, and the state talked about it. The brand name is Celexa, and it's citalopram is the drug that treats. It can treat antidepressant drug, and was also for her anxiety. You'll find out a lot about this particular drug. And now, what the state said, the evidence will show that what Mrs. Ward would do, unlike many people who have pills that they have to take, when it's Monday, you pop up your Monday, and then you take your Monday pill. And it's Tuesday, and then you take your Tuesday pill. She didn't do it that way. She just kind of kept her medications in her pocketbook or whatever, and sometimes she would forget she took them, she took them, she forgot she would take them, and she would take more than she was supposed to. You'll hear that sometimes if she was unhappy, regardless of what she had taken or not taken in terms of prescription the day, she would take her happy pills. So there was a history of her over-medicating herself, which became more and more concentrated as the pressure on her personally built. Now, you're going to hear a little bit about this drug, citalopram, and you're going to hear about the warning on that package. What's the warning on that package? And you will learn that the warning includes aggressive behavior in all patients when there is a significant change in dosage. This is the warning that the manufacturer is giving. Includes aggressive behavior in all patients when there is a significant change in dosage. And so the warning is telling us not that she's going to go over the corner and fall asleep because it's an antidepressant, but that significant overdosage can cause this aggression. You're also going to learn about this in terms of the drinking and the Celexa. You're going to learn that there'll be testimony that the combination of the two, the combination of alcohol, and you'll learn a lot about Mrs. Ward's red wine. She would drink red wine, and under pressure she would drink more red wine. That the alcohol and the Celexa together can have a combination which will give you anxiety, even hallucinations. Anxiety, even hallucinations. Now, you'll learn that drinking too much and over-medicating can have very dangerous consequences. You'll hear testimony about in the house that there were several red wine bottles that were empty. And the science will tell us that at the time of her death that she had 1.5 times the legal amount of alcohol in her system. And you'll also learn that she had 4 times the maximum dosage of the citalopram that she should have had in her system. 4 times the maximum. And we're going to get in a little bit later in the opening. I'm going to talk about the reason why we have to get into an issue about distribution and not know exactly what was in Mrs. Ward's system at the time of her death. Because Mrs. Ward's body was in the possession of course, of the state. And you will learn that they had access to something that could have given you the answer with certainty. They had the contents of her stomach. If they had simply taken a test to test the contents of her stomach, which were pinkish in color, the color of Celexa pills, then there wouldn't be any need to have any discussion about redistribution and whether or not that applies to Celexa or whether or not it applies to anything else. There, you would have an absolute answer, and you wouldn't have to guess. What they did? They made a decision on their own to throw it away and not test it. So the government made a decision, or the medical examiner made a decision to throw it away. Now, you're going to learn that, as I said, the stress building and over-medication and the drinking causing her to get closer, and she was always on that edge. There's one thing I want to talk to you about now. Why? Why would Bob Ward take the life of his wife if, as the state has charged? Why? At the conclusion of the opening statement of counsel, he said, well, the cocktail of combination of pressure and alcohol and Mr. Ward had pressure on him as well, and maybe that's what caused him to kill his wife. You're going to find out, to the contrary, that the one thing that could save Bob Ward's family financially was for Diane Ward to remain alive. That is so important. You're going to find out that the main or the only way for Bob Ward and his family to survive financially was for Diane Ward to remain alive. Mr. Gillen, what are you talking about? What's your point? Well, I'll tell you. In Florida, there is a particular law. It's called tenants by entirety. And this is how it works. And you're going to hear testimony about this. It's critical. It's critical to this case. And this is what it says. Because we've heard in testimony about Mr. Ward, being, and you'll hear testimony about Mr. Ward's company and Mr. Ward being sued and this sort of thing. But you will learn in Florida, tenants by entirety. And what this means is if Bob and Diane Ward held assets jointly, in other words, if they have a savings account with $100,000 in it, and they're both on that account, as long Bob Ward's creditors, the people that were chasing him to get money from him and suing him, they could not get their hands on those assets as long as one thing happened, as long as Diane Ward was alive. As long as Diane and Bob Ward were on the accounts and held assets jointly, and all the people that were causing that pressure to come down on Mr. Ward, all of that, they couldn't get their hands in there to get access to millions of dollars in jointly held assets, millions of dollars in jointly held assets, as long as Diane Ward was alive. She was the family's financial safe haven. And you will hear that her death was a financial catastrophe for the Ward family. Diane's death was a financial catastrophe. It was an absolute tragedy first. But as it relates to motive, it was a financial catastrophe. So contrary to having any motive to have his wife killed, you will learn that Bob Ward had every motive to make sure of all the things that could happen in the pressure cooker of their lives. The one thing that was the saving point was his wife remaining alive. Now, you're going to hear testimony about whether or not the deposition was set up, and it's very simple. There was a deposition that was set up for Mrs. Ward for September the 24th, and there were conversations on the phone with other counsel on that Friday before, September the 18th. Bottom line, you'll hear, because there had been requests for documentation, and the lawyers, excuse me, from Ms. Ward said, look, we're not doing it twice. So we're not going to be there on Thursday, because we're not going to give you documents. Then you say, well, we need to do it again. We need to follow up. We're not going to do the deposition twice. As a matter of fact, her lawyer sent an email saying, we're not going to be there. There's no court order making her there. There was a deposition pursuant to agreement. But we're not doing it twice, and so we're not going to be there. And that's it on that deposition. That's it. It wasn't going to happen. Now, what you will find on the afternoon and the early evening of September the 21st, you'll find that several people were talking to Mrs. Ward. And a lot of them, or some of them, may come in and testify. As a matter of fact, there's one former friend that she hadn't seen in a long time. They started chatting about getting on Facebook and this sort of thing. And she talked to her in that late afternoon, early evening. She didn't talk to her on face-to-face. She didn't talk to her on Skype. She couldn't see her. And she really hadn't had a lot of experience with her in the earlier years. They were catching up. But during that call, it's interesting because she said, "Oh well, I'm going to go fix a Bob dinner and have another glass of red wine." So what happens from the time of that call until the 411 call or the 911 call? What happens? Well, taking the government's evidence that on the patio there was that Mrs. Ward threw a wine glass at the back of Mr. Ward. Let's take that. Threw a glass of wine at his back, and the glass of wine broke. Now, that's the same Mrs. Ward that earlier in the evening had a chatty conversation with some of her friends. But what you have is a situation out on the patio where the broken glass is. There are no overturned tables. There are no signs whatsoever The law enforcement officials will acknowledge this during their testimony. There was no sign of any kind of fight between Bob Ward and Diane Ward. There is no evidence or no fact whatsoever that he responded in any way to her throwing, throwing red wine on his back. So, what you have is a situation where you then go upstairs. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit right now about the evidence, and we're going to talk about evidence that was destroyed or ignored. Evidence that was destroyed or ignored by the state. What are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about DNA evidence. We're going to talk about this gunshot residue, which is what we refer to as GSR. The stomach contents, which I briefly mentioned. Blood patterns, estimated distance, fiber testing on clothes, fingerprints, fingernails, no defensive wounds. Now let's talk about DNA testing. Now, you're going to learn that when the crime scene investigator went, what she wanted to do is she was testing there at the scene for DNA. So you don't have to be Sherlock Holmes to figure out what you really want to know is whose DNA is on the trigger. Whose DNA is on the trigger? So what the crime scene technician did is that she swabbed the trigger and put that separately away, like she was supposed to do. And then she swabbed on the grip and kept that separate from the trigger, like she was supposed to do. That's what she was supposed to do. So that way, you could go in and you could make a determination about whether there was something on that somebody was, whether if Diane's DNA is on the trigger, we probably wouldn't even be here. But you know what happened? Now you have to guess. Now you have to take a guess. And the reason why you have to take a guess is because the government did something that they shouldn't have done, I submit. So that you will never know the results on the DNA on the trigger for that big ultimate question of who pulled the trigger, because they combined them. At the lab, well, we just figure we want to, or we think it's okay. And so there will be no testimony about those separate tests of DNA on the trigger and separate DNA tests on the grip. And the reason is they got mixed up together and they tested under the theory that, well, if you got your hand on the grip, you got your hand on the trigger. That's not true. That is not true. You could have your hand on the grip, not have your hand on the trigger, or you could have your hand on the trigger. But if you have your hand, or if you have DNA on the trigger, if Diane Ward had DNA on the trigger, case over. Destroyed by the government. Now, what else? At the scene, you'll learn that there was a holster there. Now, all this, the holster is over on the nightstand, as you will learn, on Bob Ward's side of the bed. Now, Bob Ward had his side of the bed. Diane Ward had her side of the bed. This, what happens here goes on Bob Ward's side of the bed. Now, you'll learn that, Diane Ward wasn't somebody who was taking that gun out and going out and target practicing, doing all that. There won't be any testimony about that at all. It was Bob Ward's gun. So finding Bob Ward's gun on his own, DNA on his own gun, that doesn't help you much, does it? But if you find Diane's DNA on the gun, that tells you something. And there was Diane Ward's DNA on the gun. Now, what else didn't they do? What they didn't do, there's the holster. As I said before, you don't have to be Sherlock Holmes to figure this one out. If you're trying to find out who pulled the gun out of the holster, or you're trying to find out whether Diane Ward pulled the gun out of the holster, then you run DNA tests on the holster. They didn't do that. So there's no way they can come in here and tell you what their DNA swabbing showed on the examination of the holster, because they decided at the scene that wasn't important and they weren't going to do it, and they didn't do it. But then they come into court and they want you to speculate and to conclude and to assume that Bob Ward, with no motive whatsoever, killed his wife. Now, no DNA on the holster. Now let's talk a little bit about gunshot residue. Now, gunshot residue, if a gun is fired, if you got a revolver like that, and coming out of the cylinder, you can get this gunshot residue on your hands. You've got to have three elements in order for it to be gunshot residue. And there are experts that go and they look at that, and they're able to figure out whether somebody has gunshot residue on it. And it's important to test soon after an incident, and it's important to test as quickly as you can, because gunshot residue, even though you can't really see it, it's something that can shake off. And when it shakes off, it can be gone. You can walk around or bump or whatever, and it's gone. So what you want to do is you want to test the gunshot residue test as quickly as you can on the scene. So you want to do it on the scene so there won't be any question about whether or not somebody has gunshot residue on their hands. So Mr. Ward did not have his hands tested for gunshot residue at the scene, nor did Mrs. Ward have her hands tested at the scene for gunshot residue. Why is that important? Well, in gunshot residue, if you're in control of the scene, particularly it's indoors, this isn't outdoors and it's raining, this is indoors in a controlled environment. Sherlock Holmes, you want to be able to get all of your information together as completely as you can while you're there in the scene, rather than moving people away and allowing for gunshot residue to fall off the hands of Mrs. Ward. They do not test Mrs. Ward's. She's there. They've got their examiners everywhere. One of the gentlemen who does gunshot residue, I think, was at the house twice that night. Did he test Diane Ward's hands for gunshot residue that night? So there'd be no question to this jury about whether or not she had gunshot residue on her hands as she was there in the bedroom on the floor? The answer is no. No gunshot residue done on Mrs. Ward in the bedroom at the scene. Okay? So what do? Well, they say, what we're going to do is we're going to bag her hands up. And you'll see these bags. We're going to bag her hands up. And when we take her down to the medical examiners, that way, we're not, if something gets jostled, whatever, we're not going to lose it. So they don't test there. They bag her hands up. And, of course, the jostling and the moving and traveling 10 miles, being carried downstairs, all this can cause that in the contact with the bags, can all have an impact on the gunshot residue. But they don't do it at the scene. They take her away. Now, what do they do on the gunshot residue after that? Well, when they cut the bags off her hands, they do a couple of things that they run gunshot residue. Then we'll get a little bit into the science of whether that was done appropriately given the temperature of the room, and she had been in a cold storage area, and then the gunshot testing. We'll get into that. But two important things. One is that here are the bags that they tell us they have the hands in the bag so that if anything is fallen out, then it's not, it's preserved. Did they test the insides of the bags for gunshot residue? I think you know the answer. No, they didn't. No testing of the bags for gunshot residue, even though they bagged her hands up. And the gunshot residue results, if there was a small amount of gunshot residue found on one of those two people, there was a small amount of gunshot residue found on either Bob Ward or Diane Ward. Who do you think it was? Diane Ward. The only gunshot residue found was on Diane Ward. And how much, we'll never be able to know because they didn't test out on the scene and they didn't test the bags. Quickly on the stomach contents. I mentioned this earlier. With no question about or trying to guess or speculate about what drugs were in her body, because we didn't have, the government had her stomach contents. And all they had to do was run the test. Take a sample, send it to the lab. And we wouldn't have to speculate about redistribution or this or that, or competing experts talking about whether or not citalopram can be redistributed, or is it more or less than some other substance. They had it, and they threw it out. Yet they come into court, and they want you to find beyond a reasonable doubt that Bob Ward killed his wife. That's what they want you to do. But the redistribution tests, which were done, showed, as we said before, the 4 times the maximum dosage of the Celexa. Blood patterns. What do the blood patterns tell us? Well, blood patterns tell us that Mrs. Ward died instantly. Also, importantly, died on Mr. Ward's side of the bed. But they didn't call an examiner to the scene to examine the blood patterns on the wall at the scene. Nor did they cut out the wall or do what they could do. They did not call the expert to the scene. So we don't have someone who can say, yeah, I'm a blood pattern expert. I went out there that night. This is what I found. What you have is someone saying, I'd like to show you this photograph. What do you think? Estimated distances. Let's talk about estimated distances. Now, an estimated distance has to do with the concept that the photographs on Mrs. Ward's face with what they call the stipplings, which was the powder which goes out and the particles that go out, burn, unburn, and create a pattern on the face. Now, what they do is they later decide, well, let's do a test with the same gun. First of all, they take ammo they bought in the store, and then they go down and they test it. Now, we all know, or you will learn from experts, even ammo in the same box has a different chemical or a different amount of gunpowder and different components, and so they're not always exactly the same. But what they did here is they said, well, we think this is similar enough, and we're going to test fire from 6 inches, 12 inches, 18 inches, and 24 and 30. Now, what they didn't do is they could have done 9, 15. They could have done 3 inches, but they didn't. They did 6. They did 6. One thing you learn, this is not an exact science. There's nobody on either side that can tell you the exact distance between the muzzle when it went off and the patterns on Mrs. Ward's face. All they can do is give you an estimate, give you a range, based upon kind of looking at it, and that's all they can do. Now, as I said before, this testing was on a flat surface, didn't do anything that made it look like it was the face of a human being, where you can have the contours, that sort of thing. They didn't do that. They did not use, a lot of experts suggest they used pigskin, didn't use pigskin, didn't do any of that. But then they came back. As a matter of fact, the gentleman who conducted the test, that did the test firing, his department didn't have at the time even a protocol to make a conclusion about the distances, so he couldn't even give you an opinion. And so he has to send it down to the medical examiner who goes, oh, I've got an opinion, and this is my opinion. But the man, the law enforcement officer ran the test. They didn't even have a protocol in place to give you an opinion about the distance. So the distance is something that can only, in a rough way, be guesstimated at or estimated at. Next point, fiber testing. Now, fiber testing. We have here, and we're talking about, you're hearing testimony about these projectiles that go out. We're hearing testimony about gunshot residue that kind of goes out in an area from the gun. So one would think that law enforcement, in order to find out where the gun was going, who was where and when, one would think they would test the clothing of Mrs. Ward and Mr. Ward for gunshot residue or for these stipplings. Nope. No test. So they can't tell you what their results were in that respect. Fingerprints. Well, now, surely, if you're out there at the scene and you're examining the scene and you're a fingerprint expert or you're a technician that can take fingerprints, you would want to test to find out whether or not Mrs. Ward's fingerprints were on the side of the table stand on Mr. Ward's side where the gun was. Because that's his side of the bed and his gun, so you would think the top of the table of the nightstand and the sides would be tested for fingerprints to determine whether or not her fingerprints were there. Same answer. No fingerprint testing on the nightstand and no fingerprint testing on the side, so that we could find out, or you could find out, whether or not Diane Ward's fingerprints were over there. All right. Well, they clipped her fingernails. Did they do tests on the fingernails to determine whether or not there was gunshot residue under her fingernails, or whether or not there was there any sort of scratching, or would she have any kind of scratching if there was some sort of battle between Mr. Ward and Mrs. Ward? They didn't do that. There's no testing on the fingernails. And you'll hear the investigators say, I didn't do that. And please listen to this. Very important. Because there was no evidence of a physical struggle between Mr. Ward and Mrs. Ward. No evidence. Nothing turned over, nothing in the room that would show that there was some sort of little battle. None. Even so much so that on the scene they decided they weren't even going to do the testing under the fingernails. Now, no defensive wounds were found on either Bob or Diane Ward. And what we mean by defensive wounds, you will understand that means if somebody's in a struggle and they're battling or they're pushing or there could be scratches or bruises, no defensive wounds at all. And that's because there was no physical altercation or fight between Bob Ward and Diane Ward. Very important. And then you're going to hear about some folks who will come in and testify, and family members. Family members will come in and testify, and they knew of all the witnesses, I would suggest, Diane and Bob Ward and their relationship the best, and knew the most about their Mrs. Ward. The three of those people will testify in support of Mr. Ward. And those three people are Diane Ward's own sister, Paula Ward. Paul Siri. Diane's daughter, Mallory, and Diane's daughter, Sarah, will all testify in this courtroom. At the end of this trial, based upon the evidence and the lack of evidence, I will come back before you and I'll ask you to return a verdict that speaks the truth, a verdict of not guilty. Thank you very much.
Thank you.